Dear audience, welcome to Simania Salon Readings, a platform I coordinate as part of the activities organized by the Association of Latin American Jewish Studies, known as LAJSA, which I warmly invite you to join. I am Cynthia Gabbay, a writer and researcher working at the National Scientific and Technical Research Council, CONICET, at the Humanities Research Laboratory of the National University of San Martin, Argentina. Today, we gather for the presentation of the book Allende, Pinochet, and the Jews, written by Gustavo Guzmán. Simania, meaning bookmark in Hebrew, was created as a forum for discussing books that contribute to the field of Latin American Jewish studies. I would like to renew this invitation. Whether you are an author or a curious reader, LAJSA welcomes you to use this space to engage in thoughtful dialogue about books and scholarship that enrich our understanding of the field. Simania's meetings encourage the multilingual debate that is characteristic of Jewish cultures. While the official languages of LAJSA are Spanish, Portuguese, and English, we are open to incorporating other languages into Simania. Sorry, just 1 second. Our next meeting will take place next month on June 15, and we will present the volume The Holocaust and Latin America, Migration, Resettlement, and Memory, edited by Daniela Gleiser, Emmanuel Cahan, and Yael Siman. With that said, I will now introduce today's participants. Gustavo Guzmán is a historian specializing in Jewish history and anti-Semitism in Latin America. He earned his PhD in history from Tel Aviv University in 2021, where he completed a dissertation on Chilean right-wing attitudes towards Jews under the supervision of Professor Raanan Rein. Dr. Guzmán currently holds a research fellowship at the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, with a project on the Latin American left, Israel, and the Jews. In September 2026, he will begin a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for the Study of Antisemitism, New York University, with a project titled A New Architecture for the Study of Antisemitism in Latin America. Dr. Guzmán is the author of Attitudes of the Chilean Right Toward Jews, published in 2022, Allende, Pinochet, and the Jews, published this year, which we present now, and Antisemitism and Philosemitism in Latin America between 1891 and 1991, forthcoming in 2027. Professor Raanan Rein is the Alexander Grass Chair in Jewish Studies at the University of Florida, Gainesville, and the Elias Suraski Professor of Latin American Spanish History at Tel Aviv University. Former Vice President of Tel Aviv University and ex-president of the Latin American Jewish Studies Association, Rein is the author and editor of dozens of books, most recently Anti-Fascism on Both Sides of the Mediterranean, Jewish Volunteers from Palestine in the Spanish Civil War, forthcoming in 2027. The Argentine government awarded him the title of Commander in the Order of the Liberator San Martin for his contribution to Argentine culture, and likewise the Spanish king awarded him the title of Commander in the Order of the Civil Merit. Valeria Navarro-Rosenblatt holds a PhD in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research focuses on Latin American Jewry, especially Chilean Jews, politics, and human rights. She has published several articles regarding Jewish life in Chile, the political experience and memory of communist Jews. She's a professor at the Universidad Diego Portales in Santiago, Chile. So, we will start hearing Gustavo Guzmán, the author of Allende, Pinochet, and the Jews. Please, Gustavo.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Thank you very much to everyone who has connected today, who has joined us in this presentation. I just want to give just a brief context about this book, my second book, Allende, Pinochet, and the Jews. As some of you probably know, in 2022, I published my first book titled Attitudes of the Chilean Right Toward Jews. And well, chapter 5, which was about the first 5 years of the Pinochet regime, attracted a lot of attention within some segments of the academia. I was interviewed for a couple of podcasts about this topic, so I wanted to expand this, okay? But I was hired by a research project at the Free University of Berlin in 2023. Our plan was to reconstruct the return migration of Holocaust survivors, German-speaking Holocaust survivors from Latin America to Germany, specifically to Berlin during the Cold War. However, alas, due to the terrorist attacks of October 7, 2023, I could not travel to Jerusalem to conduct research. This forced me to adapt to the new conditions, the inability to access to the archives in Jerusalem. So I expanded on this idea that I had about the Pinochet and Allende, the Jews. I want to thank, of course, the Free University of Berlin, Professor Stefan Rink in this regard, and I also want to thank the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Professor Manuela Consoni, because this project actually began when I was there. Okay, and just that, and now I want to hear what Professor Rein and Dr. Navarro-Rosenblatt think about my book. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Cynthia, for this presentation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here and to congratulate Dr. Gustavo Guzmán on the publication of his new book, Allende, Pinochet, and the Jews. Gustavo is a highly productive scholar, and his academic work seems to develop in an incremental fashion. Readers of his first book, Attitudes of the Chilean Right Towards Jews, published in 2022 by Brill in its Jewish Latin American series, will notice how this new book goes out of the previous one. And in a year from now, readers of Allende, Pinochet, and the Jews will likely recognize how his forthcoming work on anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism in Latin America flows from the current volume. The same applies to the co-edited volume that Gustavo and I are currently preparing, Latin America's Strongmen and the Jews. I will return to this point in a few minutes. Allende, Pinochet, and the Jews complicates our understanding of Jewish life in the Americas under different political circumstances. Another major merit of the book is its relevance to contemporary debates about Jews and authoritarian regimes beyond Latin America, in both Europe and the Americas, during a period of growing authoritarianism. Even readers who are not especially interested in Chilean history or in Chilean politics may still find the book highly relevant. In the book, Gustavo emphasizes the need to discuss this triangular relationship among Latin American governments, local Jewish communities, and the State of Israel. Since 1948, all Jews have had a homeland, whether they like it or not. They may be non-Zionist, they may be anti-Zionist, yet this homeland is imposed upon them both by national political leaders and large sectors of public opinion, on the one hand, and by the State of Israel, which claims to speak on behalf of all Jews, on the other hand. This dynamic has had certain advantages for Jews in Latin America, as well as for Israel. Since the 1950s, political leaders on both the left and the right have shared the belief that a friendly attitude towards local Jews and good relations with the Jewish state would benefit their country's bilateral relations with the United States. Political leaders and broad sectors of public opinion in many Latin American countries have also believed in the enormous power, in the enormous influence supposedly wielded by Jews in the United States, and in Israel's ability to ensure that the major American media outlets portray the countries more favorably. Israeli representatives have often cultivated these perceptions, or at least have not sought to dispel them. In his memoir, Yaakov Tzur, the first Israeli ambassador to Uruguay and Argentina, recounts a meeting with the Argentine president, Juan Perón, during which the Argentine leader asked the Israeli diplomat to use Israel's influence in the United States in order to alter Washington's policy towards Buenos Aires. Of course, I did not correct him, Tzur remarks in his memoir. Such perceptions and beliefs, however, as well as the identification of Jews with the Jewish state, also have a downside. Jews identified with Israel, again, whether they wish it or not, often become targets of anti-Israel sentiments. Since 1967, criticism of Israel has increasingly been accompanied by varying degrees of anti-Semitism, first encouraged by the Soviet Union and later by radical Islamic movements. During the past 3 years, these tendencies have reached a peak, zenith, as although it's perfectly legitimate to criticize Israel's extreme right-wing government, this criticism has at times employed anti-Semitic tropes. Gustavo emphasizes the relative absence of violent anti-Semitism in 20th century Chile, and points to more continuities than ruptures in attitudes towards Jews under the governments of the Marxist President Salvador Allende and Army General Augusto Pinochet. Both governments maintained friendly relations with Jews and with Israel. Their motivations and reasoning differed, that's for sure, but in practice, their policies were not as dissimilar as one might expect. Consequently, the attitudes manifested by Jewish Chileans towards one regime or the other had less to do with ethnic concerns than with political and ideological positions or social status or economic interests. I use the term Jewish Chileans because Gustavo makes clear both the heterogeneity of the Jewish population in Chile and the importance of distinguishing between affiliated and non-affiliated Jews. Since many Jewish Chileans belonged to the middle and upper classes, it is not surprising that they shared the same reservations about Allende as many other middle-class and upper-class Chileans. Indeed, the very concept of community is challenged here in this book, unless one refers specifically to the organized Jewish community and its institutions. Like Gustavo's previous book, this volume is based on a wide variety of primary and secondary sources and demonstrates the ideological and social diversity of the Pinochetistas. The book, and especially its epilogue, also points towards Gustavo's future projects. One focuses on anti-Semitism in Latin America and Jewish responses to it, and it will surely constitute an important contribution to the scholarship on anti-Semitism by incorporating the Global South into the discussion, but particularly because Gustavo insists time and again that Latin America is not Europe. That is, that concepts developed primarily for the study and understanding of European societies should not simply be imposed on Latin American realities. In the epilogue, Gustavo refers to the case of Nazi war criminal Walter Rauff and his supposed role in the torture apparatus of the Pinochet dictatorship. Several authors point to an alleged continuity between 1940s Nazi Germany and the 1970s dictatorships of Chile, Argentina, or Bolivia, if we take into consideration the case of Klaus Barbie, for example. This argument is implied, in fact, more than implied, in the recent book of Philip Sands, 38 Londres Street. And Gustavo, correctly, I think, challenges the existence of such a continuity. Since a trilogy on the red lines is important, but at the same time misses sometimes when it comes to understanding Latin American societies. The second project is the so-called co-edited volume that I mentioned earlier, devoted to Latin America's strongmen such as Pinochet and the Jews. Here again, Gustavo, and in this case myself as well, seek to emphasize that although the Latin American left, broadly speaking, expressed solidarity with the Jews and with the anti-fascist struggle during the first half of the 20th century, this does not mean that the majority of Jews supported left-wing governments or opposed right-wing authoritarian regimes. Scholars tend to argue that historically and even contemporarily, Jewish communities generally rely on liberal democracies and pluralism for their safety and flourishing. Because authoritarian regimes inherently demand conformity and often scapegoat minorities, they consistently pose severe domestic threat to Jewish populations. Is that so? The Jewish magazine Moment held a debate a couple of years ago under the title, "Can Jews Ever Flourish Under Authoritarians?" There were different answers to these questions. Michael Walzer, for example, said, and I quote, "No, today's authoritarian regimes are generally dangerous for Jews. Some, strangely, are anti-Semitic at home, but pro-Israel abroad. But for Jews domestically, liberal democracy, with its commitment to pluralism and tolerance, is safer than most any other authoritarian regime." He continues, "Most current authoritarianism is populist in character, and we are not generally part of the people, quote unquote, encompassed by the term. Authoritarians generally come with a commitment to a monolithic culture, with a non-pluralist notion of national identity and a strong bias against immigrants. That makes the world too small for Jews," end of quote. Others offered different and more nuanced responses. Yes, they said, if you are talking about organized Jewish communities, not individual modern Jews. Jews flourished in non-democratic contexts for millennia. Jews can do well under authoritarianism that doesn't actually kill them. Even in Tsarist Russia, they managed to survive and create a wonderful culture. The historian Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi, in an essay called "Servants of Kings, Not Servants of Servants," argued that Jews throughout European history greatly valued having the ear of the king and did not bother with lesser bureaucrats. The very many cases of Latin American strongmen, including Alfredo Stroessner of Paraguay, Velasco Ibarra of Ecuador, Fidel Castro in Cuba, or Pinochet in Chile, show aspects of this tendency. So are there advantages for Jewish communities under the enforced order of illiberal societies? There were functioning synagogues in Moscow and Leningrad under a communism, in Buenos Aires during the brutal military or civic military dictatorship of the 1970s. So at least for the organized Jewish communities, things were clear. Not ideal, but clear. In a democratic and pluralistic society, you might have competing groups of Jews, and this makes some Jewish leaders uncomfortable. So going back to the book itself, when Gustavo discusses Pinochet's remarkably positive approach to Jews since the beginning of the dictatorship, he certainly challenges several commonly held notions and assumptions as to Jewish experiences in Latin America during periods of military rule, as well as Jewish support for nationalist movements in the continent, by emphasizing some of the unique characters of Chilean society and politics, and he refers mostly to the second half of the 20th century. Gustavo's book raises broader questions as to the social integration of Jewish immigrants in Latin America, the attitudes of the Catholic establishment and right-wing groups towards a group of immigrants that was not always and not everywhere, a desired group of immigrants, and also a group of immigrants that was not always or everywhere considered as white. The Jewish Chilean community has been characterized by a polyphony of voices on different issues, and while there are more than a few supporters of the left-wing parties and or of the Allende regime, there were certainly more than a few who supported the military coup against Allende and the Pinochet regime for very many years. The concept of Jewish community, as I said, might be misleading sometimes. Therefore, the pretension of organized community leaders to represent all Jews is often problematic, to say the least. This also brings to light the question of the supposed Jewish solidarity, as we know of cases in which the organized Jewish communities of South America did not always make sufficient efforts to come to the rescue of leftist Jews persecuted by the military dictatorship. Jewish Chileans have enjoyed a conspicuous upward mobility and therefore became a privileged minority. Considered as white in Chilean society, many became wealthy and influential people, and as such has had an understandable fear of the Allende government and its social and economic policies. The military regime, on the other hand, seemed to promise to defend their class-based interests. In the Cold War international climate, Pinochet's Chile decidedly stood behind the United States. The fact that Israel was an ally, is an ally of the Americans, and the belief in the power and influence of Jews in the US certainly pushed the regime to adopt favorable policies toward local Jewry and the Jewish state as well. In the conclusions of each of the book's two parts, Gustavo offers a comparative perspective looking at Jewish experiences in other countries of South America. For example, unlike in Argentina, Jewish Chileans formed part of Chile's armed forces all along the 20th century. This is an important issue with a symbolic weight as well, as the armed forces tend to present themselves as the essence of patriotism and of sovereignty. Becoming part of the armed forces is a way to become an integral part of the nation. At the same time, Gustavo points to the difference in the attitudes of the Catholic establishment towards Jews in Chile and in Argentina. And he concludes that in Chile, right-wing priests and right-wing military officers were more concerned with the communists, quote unquote, than with the Jews. In Argentina, such a distinction hardly existed. Jews and Bolsheviks often seemed to be one and the same. And yet another difference was that in Chile, again, unlike Argentina, the accusation of Jews as having a dual loyalty or a double loyalty was less common. Maybe I will stop here and let Valeria continue with her comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Raanan. Please, Valeria, we hear you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you, Raanan. Welcome, everyone. Gustavo's book is, as Raanan was explaining, is a continuation of his previous work, and you can see how from the beginning, from his first articles, he was approaching the issues of anti-Semitism and what happened with the local Nazis group in the 1930s. That was the first type of articles that Gustavo was making. And we see a very important development throughout his research for his PhD that ended in his previous book that tried to explain the attitudes of the right wing towards Jews. Here we have a different perspective that also evolves from his previous research. And here we try to understand, Gustavo tries to understand how Pinochet and how Allende were, how do you say it in English? They were image or were representing a certain type of social stances towards Jews. Okay. So the book itself is presented by two parts. The first one between Allende and the Jews, and the second about Pinochet and the Jews. In the first part of the first part, Gustavo makes like a summary or a presentation of both Jews who were leftist, of Allende's presence and Allende's continuous attitude towards the Jews, and of those Jews who became anti-Allende. Taken as a whole, that first part tries to understand what was the links and what was the particularity of Allende as a politician, as a senator, later as a president, towards this group. So in the beginning, when Gustavo presents Allende, he explains that Allende was not an unusual left-wing politician. He was from a traditional left that was in favor of those who were oppressed, and in that time, the Jews were in that position. And Allende's long-standing position towards the Jews is how do you...
Vale, si prefiere hablar en español, puede
no.
hacerlo. No hay
Sí, es
problema.
que quiero hacerlo en inglés, pero quiero hacer, hay algunas palabras como específicas que se me olvidan, pero un momento. His continuous attitudes toward Jews show how he was coherent in his self-development as a politician. So from the help he presented to ship a boat in Uruguay, allowing them to go to Chile, from being the first word in the Chilean Israeli Cultural Center, and later in La Habana in 1966, when there was a stance against Israel, Allende was in a continuous position of favoring the Jews, of presenting them as an ally of the Jews. And that came from an internal understanding of who the Jews were and of the Jews that he had met, of his friends. That's in one hand. In the other hand, we have a presence of what Allende as a president had towards the Jews during his 3 years mandate, during his mandate and then at the end of the coup. So what Gustavo calls as a philo-Semitism was translated into a positive stand towards Israel through a long-standing agricultural help from Israel to Chile, and from this wish to present itself as an ally of Israel, even though there were strong presence of pro-Arab voices in the Allende's government. In this sense, the triangular relation presented by Gustavo between Allende, the Jewish community, and Israel, the strongest pillars of that triangulation during Allende's time was Allende and was Israel rather than the Jewish community. The Jewish community, in this sense, was more diverse, and in this same sense, the organized community, as Raanan was explaining, show its diversity and show its willingness to collaborate with Allende or to present the Jewish voices, but not to support the government or to make a bigger stand. So I hope that it's being clear, this image that I'm trying to present. And why that stance in the Jewish communities was the weakest link? It was because of the same diversity that we find in the Jewish community, internal Jewish community. And how Gustavo presents the notions, the feelings, the ambience in Chile during Allende through the Jewish lens is a particular way, a very interesting and very accurate way to understand how Chilean Jews were part of the general sentiment of discomfort from the middle class towards Allende, but that ideologically we could find some Jews from that same middle class being part of the government because they were part of a long-standing tradition of public education through the Universidad de Chile, through the political parties. And that became a division that, even though some of us have researched about that, it's not always clear that that division was inside the Jewish community. So it's not a whole, it's not like a whole front that goes either to Allende or against Allende. And that what allowed those Jews who were anti-Allende to gain more spaces in the next period of time during Pinochet was this lack of anti-Semitism, or this the possibility for them to build a space of their own. That would be like a general summary of the first part. A general summary of the second part of the book. We need to understand that Gustavo's work is based on a broadly variety of primary sources. He had the opportunity to go to multiple archives, and the work in the AJC and the Anti-Defamation League and in the International Bnei Brit archives is wonderful. It's wonderful to have that the access to that type of sources, because one of the first issues that this new wave of Latin American Jewish studies presented in 2008 with Rethinking Latin American Jewish History is that we cannot continue seeing only the sources from inside the Jewish and the local community. So to have a perspective from what the other leaders from outside the local Jewish communities were saying about what they thought the Jews were experiencing, or what the leadership were inclined to think, is a wonderful, let's say, gift that Gustavo gives to us. Because not everyone has the opportunity to go to those archives, and seeing that information is is both a confirmation of this different interpretation from outside Jewish leaders, and also a confirmation of what the local Jewish community was saying from the inside. So when we have the second part, General Pinochet and the Jews, first we have this idea that first it was, as he says, a big bang or a big crash. It was September 11, 1973 was a watershed moment that differentiated the position of Jews, Jewish leftists and Jewish right wings, because they had to take a position. And this same community that was not willing to present a position, or that was the weakest link in the triangular relationship that Gustavo present, it becomes one of the strongholds of this triangular relation. So it was weak because they didn't want to present themselves as following Allende, and they didn't want to be outside of the supports toward Pinochet. And that's where the this willingness of the Jewish community receive a good echo and a good reciprocal relationship from Pinochet and from the army forces. When Gustavo develops the first part of the second part of the Pinochet and the Jews, when it becomes clear that what Israel meant for the military was different than what it had meant to previous democratic governments. Because as Pinochet needed support, international support that was not given through other stances, Israel became one of the few supports that he would have. And the relation that before between Chile and Israel was supported by cooperation in multiple areas, it became one area of support, mostly the sales of weapons and the support in international forums during the times or the moments when Chile needed certain vote or when Israel needed certain vote. What Gustavo proposes here, and which is very important, is that the pressure from Israel towards Chilean position was stronger than we thought, and that during the golden years, the third part of the book, Israel didn't need to push the sales that Israel was selling arms to Chile as a pressure point, but rather it was later with the effect of Walter Strauss. How do you say it? Los solicitaban que fuese extraditado, his extradition request, where this triangular relation becomes strained, tension, sorry. Why? Because Israel was pushing the idea that it would not sell arms to Chile if they didn't expel Rauf. And that moment in 1984 opened a gate towards anti-Semitism and to figures like Miguel Serrano to enter the discussion between Israel and Chile. So we have Israel relation to the Chilean government through arms. Before, it had other venues through which they relate. We have the Jewish community or organized community towards Pinochet that he didn't try to antagonize because of the support that he perceived he would receive from the Jews and from the Jews in other parts of the world. But we also have an open support by the current leadership from 1973 until 1984, especially Mr. Gil Sinai, who became a figure of support, who became the symbol of power for the Jewish community. And next to Gil Sinai was Rabbi Kreiman, who had this double stance of supporting the leftist Jews on supporting Pinochet. Like, Sinai and Kreiman became the Jewish agents to, in a certain way, clean the image of Pinochet in the international stance. And that's one of the things that Gustavo presents with a diverse kind of sources. And the other part that Gustavo proposes is the analysis of how the different diplomats in Chile, of Israelis in Chile, of Chileans in Israel, were part of this dialogue to create the different pressures to promote each country's interest in their own in their own representation. So the book itself is it gives this interesting, very interesting perspective that we didn't have before of this of how even though the events were unique, they gave a particular input to create this triangular relationship. And Gustavo's proposal of this interpretation is something new, is something unique, both for Chilean Jewish history, for Chilean history, that we could further try to understand Pinochet's relation to other diplomats or international international give me a moment, of international construction, if we try to understand not only the big institutional organizations, what they were saying towards Pinochet, but also how different delegations were interpreting or trying to push for certain interest from Pinochet and from their countries in Chile. So that's an important proposal. And so if we go to the end of the book, we see how this triangulation starts to crumble at the end of the Pinochet dictatorship. And it's not only because of Walter Rauff, but it's also because the dictatorship itself was changing. It was a time where democracy was coming back, like the third wave of democracy in Latin America. And we find that what is left is an image of Jews in a certain class, with a certain position, with a certain political understanding, and we have this new opening for anti-Semitism to develop into the later years of the Concertación and of democracy. So we do have many spaces that are opened by Gustavo's work to continue and to further the Jewish history in Chile and to understand other type of historical approaches toward what happened to different minorities in Pinochet's Chile, and also of the configuration of how many intersections we can find in one period of time, in the sense that we can find other approaches and we can find other type of understanding. So Gustavo's is a groundbreaking work in the sense that he creates or he identifies new lines to go further. And so before I come to an end, I also appreciated that how Gustavo was using a certain type of analytical proposals from other researchers. So, for example, he uses this issue of unaffiliated Jews in different categories, in different aspects. He uses the acceptable, undesirable also. And Jews sometimes were in those both positions, either unaffiliated or affiliated, undesirable and undesirable. So to use the categories proposed by other researchers is also a good practice that Gustavo has. Why? Because it makes a line, a continuous use of a concept that is proposed by others. So that's a good proposition. And if I need to finish on a local stance, Gustavo's book gathers or is what? It's both the beginning and the end of a long-standing research period of time for Jews Chilean, Jewish Chileans. Both of his books contribute to the field, but also gives a space for the field to develop even further. So thank you, Gustavo, for your research. Thank you, Cynthia, for this space, and I will allow you to comment.
Thank you very much, Valeria. I would love to hear Gustavo now if you want to answer, to reply, or to add any information or analysis to what has been said.
Thank you very much to Professor Rein. Thank you very much to Valeria. Thank you very much to all of you who have joined this session. I think that the comments have been very generous. Thank you very much. They have said nothing negative, so it's very difficult for me to discuss. So I propose you that we go directly to the questions of our attendants. I think that always will help us to expand our understanding. And also, it's because Professor Rein has been my advisor, not only of my dissertation, but for all this time. Valeria is a dear colleague. We have grown, together in parallel, so they are super generous to me. I cannot thank them enough. But let's go to the questions, please.
Okay, so you can raise your hands or digitally or physically if you have a question or a comment.
If not, I'll ask. Okay. Here we go. Yeah.
Sandra, yes, please.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Gustavo. It was, I think, a really, really great contribution for Jewish studies. And I just want to know if could you maybe give us some more details on one of the key events that particularly I see in the Pinochet's period, which was the 1986 assassination attempt. I think that it was a major turning point for Pinochet's government. So if you could give us more specific details on that, maybe if it at the end of the day could test or change Chile's strategic relationship with Israel, but also the local Jewish community.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for your question. Yes, I think it's one of my favorite details, my favorite parts of the story is because, in chapter 1 of the book is titled The Jewish Allendistas, and I trace, the older generations of the Jewish Chilean left in the beginning of the 20th century. This Jewish immigrants from Russia, Yiddish speaking, who work as traders, in commerce, but regardless, they were usually communist, usually also left-wing Zionists and the like. And in 2 or 3 or even 4 generations afterwards, at the end in the 70s and in the 80s, you see these 2 figures, Raúl Pelegrín Friedman, Comandante José Miguel, who was the founder and the leader of the Frente Patriótico Manuel Rodríguez, the paramilitary communist organization. It's amazing. And he and José Joaquín Valenzuela Levy, another Jewish Chilean guy, both from upper middle class, in the case of Valenzuela Levy, upper class, I would say, both attended some of the most exclusive private schools in Santiago, but regardless of this social class identity, they were left-wing, they were Jewish, and they were, with their education, very skilled guys. They were the masterminds of this attempt on Pinochet's life, which was about to succeed. So thank you very much for asking. It's a fascinating story. I appreciate very much what Valeria said. She's a specialist in the Jewish Chilean left, no doubt about it. And I've traced some characters. but I would love that, perhaps younger researchers could expand on these specific stories. There are multiple instances. So thank you very much for your question.
Thank you, Raanan. You wanted to ask something?
I wanted to ask Gustavo to refer in some detail to his controversy, quote unquote, with Philip Sands. As Gustavo knows, this past semester I taught an undergraduate class at the University of Florida titled Nazi Fugitives in Latin America. And many of my students tended to believe that it is only through Nazi influence in South America that we can understand the brutality of the military dictatorships of the 1970s, as if without Nazi influence, there would have been no such brutal dictatorships in South America. And in a way, Sands contributes to this myth. And I'd like to hear some more from Gustavo challenging this myth.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Rein, for your question. For those who haven't read the book yet, part 1 is divided into 3 chapters, President Allende and the Jews. Part 2 is divided into 4 chapters, General Pinochet and the Jews, and an epilogue, which is a much shorter piece. I do not speak about that. I go to the detention of General Pinochet in London in 1998, and how during that period, which marked me personally so strongly, that's the main reason why I studied history. I was a very enthusiastic opponent of Pinochet, of course, and I remain so, by the way. But when you go with what you taught me, Professor Rein, to go to like a professional examination of the evidence, the Nazi template that the international left, so to speak, used to accuse Pinochet, didn't match. The evidence didn't match this interpretation. And that's why Holocaust survivors, Auschwitz survivors, explicitly defended Pinochet in the late 90s. And this is very challenging. It is very, provoking. What many authors have done in this regard is to ignore it. We don't see that, okay? And what they do is, to apply a template, a framework, a Eurocentric framework onto the Latin American reality. And what I do specifically in the epilogue of my book is to challenge directly the book of Philip Sands, the last part of his trilogy. What is the main idea? What does Philip Sands do in his book? He tells essentially 3 stories. The first story is the life of Walter Rauff in Chile after his liberation in 1963, after the Supreme Court declines the extradition request from Germany on the basis of the statute of limitation. Between that moment and his death, Philip Sands researches this untold story, and what he finds is amazing. It's, for instance, he demonstrates that Rauff met Pinochet in the 50s in Quito, Ecuador. The second story that he tells is the story of Pinochet in London and how an agreement, a secret agreement, a behind-the-scenes agreement between the governments of London and Santiago made it possible that Pinochet escaped, or went to Chile without a punishment, not precisely a happy ending. And the third story that he tells, which is the core of the story, is how Walter Rauff allegedly played a central role in the DINA, and he falls short. And it's only rumors, hearsay, but no evidence. It's like a castle in the air. It's not solid. So my ultimate question is, what does these Eurocentric frameworks contribute to our study of the Southern Cone or the South Cone dictatorships, such as Pinochet. I think my point is that they often they obscure more than they illuminate our understanding. Why? Because when researchers try to demonstrate this, they are like pushing the evidence. This is what activists do. Activists do not manage, the contradicting evidence very well because there's a narrative to match. And I entered this business, so to speak, very, free from those narratives of pre-existing frameworks, so I can swim very freely in this regard. And on the other hand, I have proven that I'm a good faith actor, so I'm not afraid to speak free in this regard and to give ideas, try to demonstrate that I can be wrong, of course. I have no problem to admit that I'm wrong, but the importance is the matter is to go to the evidence, to the sources, what the sources tell us, not what we want to believe. So sorry for the long answer, but that's what I think.
Thank you. Any other question? Yes. Sonia, please.
Hello, and thank you very much for this interesting presentation, and especially for the book. Congratulations to Gustavo. I haven't still finished it, and I know my question is not exactly part of the book, but I'm sure as you worked so much in working about this topic, you can refer to it. I'm interested in the relations between the Jews in the different countries of the Southern Cone. I work about Paraguay, but in literature. So, but I refer to politics, of course, here. So I would like to know, because you said that the Jews arranged in different ways under authoritarian regimes. So I would like to know if there were, for example, between Argentinian and Chilean Jews, what were their relations? What could they manage together, or what was possible in this times of the 70s and 80s, of course, that I'm referring to?
Yeah, well, you know that when one has the privilege to go to these archives in New York or in Jerusalem, and one has the privilege, to be granted access to these sources, one finds out that there are a lot of sources concerning to internal conflicts of the communities, like details, like one account, a check, a balance, it's full of little things that are not what the historian, expects to find. You need to understand that, first of all, the large portions of the Latin American juries were not affiliated to any institution. Okay, often the institutions were, like a couple of dozens of people, occupying the positions for years. They were not very representative. That said, there are moments, and of course, you need to understand also the importance of Israel and the Israeli embassy in order to become a sort of backbone in this regard. But it's for some things, security related issues and the like, but not everything. Okay, so that aspect of the story, I don't focus specifically on that, but I would like to in order to give you an answer, I would like to bring to the table this moment, for instance, in 1977, when the B'nai B'rith organization, they organized a conference, an international conference in Villa del Mar. with the participation of these Chilean generals, you know, representatives of Pinochet, and representatives of multiple Latin American countries attended, you know, and the military had like the feeling that they succeeded because they have all these Jews from all Latin America. That, you know, we have the Jews on our side. But again, how representative these retinues coming were is a thing that I'm not able to answer. I think that there is a very interesting dimension of the story that I think other researchers should address. But thank you very much for your question, Sonia. Thank you.
Thanks for your answer.
Thank you, Florinda. Yes.
2 questions. And I have to say that I'm poorly informed, really, what happened in Chile, just superficial information. One thing is, you mentioned, by the way, the presence of Arab influence in Chile. We know that the Arab Muslim community in Chile has been always very important. Did it have any relevance in the processes you described? The second question, I know it's too broad and I just expect a very short answer. From the period you described to what's happening today in Chile with Jews, is there a continuity or a break? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Florinda. I will begin by the second. I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. My research, I've been researching for years these matters, but I always end in 1990 or 1991.
Okay.
I have to admit that I'm very coward in this regard. I like take distance with the present. I have to be honest. And the first question, this is very interesting. Yes, of course, the Arab presence in Chile, specifically the Palestinian one, played a role. I didn't went, you know, in depth into this topic, just like in my previous book, because there are not many scholarly studies available. The Jewish studies in Chile are far more developed than the Palestinian studies, so to speak, in Chile. There are a lot of misconceptions, exaggerations, you know. Okay, but I would respond in this briefly, Florinda, is that in the first part of the book, during the Allende years, Palestinians in general were poorly organized politically well into the 80s. For instance, a good barometer to grasp this is the football club Palestino, what the Americans would disgracefully call soccer. We call it football in English. The Palestinians had this professional football club since the 20s at least. And this football club consistently remained out of politics, never took a clear stand. Since they were relatively, the Palestinians of Chile were relatively wealthy, they didn't want to risk their position by, you know, meddling in politics, let alone national politics. So, yeah. However, there are a few personalities, political personalities of Arab descent. I don't remember the name in this moment, excuse me. There are 2 or 3, but the more important, you know, the most important advocates for the Palestinian position within the government of President Allende was Foreign Minister Clodomiro Almeida, who is not of Arab origins. So not necessarily it's a matter of ethnicity, but a matter of foreign politics with regards to the Middle East conflict. And with regards to the Pinochet years, this is fascinating because if the Jewish Chileans, made important or relatively significant contributions to the national reconstruction fundraising campaign, the Arabs gave much more money than the Jews. I would say this is not. We need to, of course, to support this with evidence. But my impression, my perception is that the Arabs of Chile were more Pinochetistas than the Jews of Chile, And regardless, and so there were some expectations regarding the position that Pinochet would take with regards to the Middle East conflict. But Pinochet, just like Allende, and regardless of their profound ideological differences, their positions move between what has been called a position of equidistance with regards to the Arab-Israeli conflict, from that position of ideal equidistance to an open preference for Israel. It's common to hear within some Jewish Chileans of the older generations to give their account that Allende was so pro-Palestinian and the like. I'm sorry, the evidence that I consulted does not back the black and white position. No. They were very, they tried to accommodate. But in general, I would say, to finish my answer, Florinda, is that the Arab position in general in all these years, politically speaking, is weak. They failed to advance their political positions, and it was due to concerns over their political, socio-economic positions within Chilean society. They didn't want to lose their position. They were very, very concerned in this regard. And in 1982, following the Sabra Shatila episode, is when, for instance, in Palestino Football Club, boom, for the first time they took a position, but it was necessary a generational change in order to provoke this change. But in general, the Jewish positions were far better defended vis-a-vis the rulers. And of course, I don't need to teach this to you, Florinda, or our colleagues in Israel, but the key term in this regard is Stadtlanut politics, because when Pinochet comes, it's like the Caesar, it's like the Tsar, it's like, the authoritarian leader. And it's like, I would say, it's like the older generations of Jewish leaders in Chile, they opened this mental toolbox, and they took, the old tool of the Stadtlanut politics, and they did it excellent. There were 2 or 3 guys, and they did it excellent. We have to be honest in this regard. Thank you for your question, Florinda. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Gustavo, we have a question by Jorge Ceballos. Jorge, I can read your question, or you can talk directly. He says, your book offers a fascinating methodological model by meticulously analyzing Chile under 2 opposing Cold War regimes with 2 important communities, Chilean Jews and Chilean Palestinian. Beyond your specific findings, how do you feel the Chilean case challenges or redefines current paradigms in Latin American Jewish studies regarding how minorities navigate extreme ideological polarization, particularly in contrast to the more traditional frameworks used for larger communities like Argentina and Brazil?
Wow.
Big question. Thank you, Jorge, my dear friend, for an excellent question. Well. A few days ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, I made a presentation of not the presentation of the book properly, like what we are doing here today, but I made a presentation about the first part of the book in a workshop in Latin American Studies here in the Free University of Berlin, not a Jewish initiative at all. I adapted my presentation because I knew that people that, bit, reluctant to challenging new interpretations of anything, specifically about Pinochet and Allende, because there's a kind of this kind of the good versus the evil, and if you challenge anything about that, the footnote, you're evil. Okay, so and the presentation was resisted, regardless of my concerns. And one of I want to give you like a symbol of the position that of the resistance to my presentation was this. General Pinochet dressed just like Hermann Goering. Therefore, you must be wrong. Why I'm telling you this absurdity here? Because what I'm presenting here is what the evidence told me. I'm just giving my interpretation. Clashes directly with a much larger understanding about the Jews as a minority. It's so different to the understanding, to the training that I received in Israel, because what the most fascinating thing for me when I arrived to Israel is that you can construct phrases such as the Jews, verb, predicate. You don't need to be scared of this, such as is the case in the Latin American historiographies. Jews are a kind of mental category which is related always with Nazi Germany, and you better don't challenge that, man. So the question of Jorge is very, very interesting. I would say short answer is that, as I repeat in the book, Latin America is not Europe. So because the Jews have this long history of persecution and violence that ended in a genocide in Europe, that does not mean necessarily that in Latin America that resonates, that makes sense. But of course, but Jorge is making me a fantastic question because he's also, ending his PhD, so he's very high level, and I hope that we have an opportunity to elaborate, a joint answer to this huge question. Thank you very much, Jorge. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for one or two questions more. Florinda.
It's not a question. I simply want to, it's a side remark if you want. In those good old days when Israelis used to go freely to Bethlehem, we were very much there. We met a lot of people, and we came out with the impression that all Arab Christians from Bethlehem had been in Chile, were going to be in Chile, or had relatives in Chile, but mostly they were enthusiastic about Chile.
Yeah.
They felt, even if they were back and living in Bethlehem, they felt themselves Chilean. It's just a personal fragment of memory. I wanted to share it with you.
Thank you, Florinda. When in my first year in Israel, I spent Christmas in Bethlehem. It was an amazing experience, and I noticed that, of course, it's amazing. But I want to show a brief story that I could not develop enough in the book about Pedro Musalem. Pedro Musalem was a second or third generation Palestinian Chilean. He was a leftist. He was from Mir, far left, revolutionary, and he joined the PLO, or one of the, another entities in that constellation. So after the coup, the new authorities in the Chilean embassy, they had all the elements to be obsessed with this guy. He was far left, PLO, anti-Israel, all the same. But what is, for me, was amazing was that the new authorities, they had, they didn't like this guy, for sure. But they were far more obsessed with the Jewish Chileans, the Jewish, who were detractors of the new military authorities. And they sent these detailed reports, like to snitching, disuse to the military authorities. And the Palestinian, who for me, I expected that it would be like the end of the world for this guy. It was not that relevant in that moment in 1974 or 1973. So thank you again, Florinda.
Thank you, Florinda.
And I wish to mention, I see here our dear friend Miriam Kravchik, I think it's the way that we pronounce it. I see that she's connected here, and I found also a source, a primary source that mentions our friend Miriam. So I invite her to read our book, because it was a fantastic fragment in the late 70s.
Well, I was going to actually to ask you about your sources or your use of personal archives, because you mentioned a lot of institutional archives, but have you used personal archives to reach information or data?
Well, not personal archives. I mean, the only personal archive that I have had access to so far are these ones that are available through the Jewish Archive of Chile. I don't remember the name at this moment of this German Jewish refugees, but not that much. What I have used extensively, and I think that has been very important for me, has been interviews, accounts, has been very illuminating. I also was relatively lucky because when I was writing my dissertation was the late days of the pandemic. So some of my interviewees, had wanted to talk. So we had these long interviews. So no, I haven't used the personal archives, only interviews, but I'm sure that might be fascinating. Yeah. Especially when it comes to, this is my position at least, to reconstruct the lives of the Jewish Pinochetistas. Because the Jewish Allendistas, my experience tells me that they are more eager to tell their stories. It's more like kind of heroic, especially within the left-wing culture. With the Pinochetistas, it's much more, a kind of more reserved regarding these memories. Another of regarding my presentation in Berlin, my recent presentation in Berlin, another of the attendants were offended when I mentioned that I found Jewish members of the fascistic group Patria y Libertad in Chile. The terrorist group Patria y Libertad had Jewish members, and one guy was offended by the evidence that I found. So yeah, very interesting things.
Thank you, Gustavo. Valeria, I have a feeling you wanted to say something. No? Okay, so we're going to close.
About personal archives?
No, in general.
No, just thank you for the opportunity for this talk and for us to gather. It's always refreshing to have a perspective about the Latin America, the Jewish studies in Chile. That is a very small fragment of a general history here. So it's always very refreshing to have this type of talk, this type of questions, and this type of reflection.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Congratulations, Gustavo. Looking forward to your next book.
Moment,
yes.
Pite. Thank you again to everyone. I want to say two things before ending. First, thank you, Cynthia. Thank you very much for your time, your generosity with your time. I cannot thank you enough. And most importantly for me, my daughter is going to watch this eventually. So I want to send a kissy to Aurora, my lovely daughter, that she will be very proud when she sees
Saludos, Aurora.
in the feed. That's it. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you, and see you next month.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.